Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. Tonight, I've got 3 disturbing true horror stories based on real accounts. I think you're really going to enjoy these. If you do, make sure to drop a like on the video and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing that. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe. I share stories like this all the time. Only about 4.4% of viewers who watch these videos are actually subscribed. I put my heart into every video, hoping it reaches someone who cares. If that's you, please subscribe. It really means more than words can say, and it keeps me going. Alright, if you're ready, let's dive straight into tonight's chilling tales. If you've ever inherited something you weren't sure you wanted, you'll understand why I hesitated the morning the lawyer handed me the keys to my uncle's ranch. I didn't go there expecting anything unusual. I figured I'd clean the place up, decide if I wanted to sell it, and move on. What I didn't expect was that the first night on that property would change every plan I thought I had, to the point where I still don't step outside after dark unless I absolutely have to. I grew up around farms, so I'm not the type who scares easy. Most noises at night make sense. Animals moving around, old wood adjusting, wind going wherever it wants. But what I heard in that barn on my first night wasn't any of that. And if I'm being honest, I still struggle explaining parts of it even now, because none of it fits with things I can logically understand. But I'll lay it out as clearly as I can, the way it happened, because leaving pieces out would only make the whole thing sound like a bad dream. It wasn't a dream. I wish it was. My uncle lived alone on a decent-sized cattle property in Kansas. Nothing fancy, but he took pride in it. I didn't visit often, mostly because he wasn't the warm, welcoming type. He wasn't rude, just closed off. He always had this guarded look, like someone who didn't want you asking too many questions. I never thought much of it until after he passed, and I started going through his place. Then I realized his whole life had been built around hiding something he didn't want anyone else finding. The house itself was fine, old but solid. The barns were in different stages of wear, except for one long building on the west side of the property. He always locked that one up and never let anyone inside. As a kid, I assumed it was where he stored equipment. As an adult, well, I found out real fast that wasn't the case. The day I arrived, I did a slow walk around the property, just getting a sense of what was what. And when I got to that long barn, I noticed something odd right away. The padlock on the front door was new, not like the other locks around the farm. He must have replaced it just weeks before he died. That alone told me he was serious about keeping it shut. But something else bothered me more. The footprints in the dust outside the door weren't his. At least not the kind he would leave. My uncle had thick, heavy work boots. The prints outside the barn were narrower, longer. They looked more like sock prints than shoes. I know how weird that sounds, but that's the closest comparison I can give you. Long, flat impressions, like someone with no shoes had been pacing in circles around the door for a while. I crouched down and checked the soil, just to convince myself I wasn't imagining it. The prints were recent, maybe a day old. That didn't make sense because the property had been unoccupied since he was found, and the lawyer made it clear nobody else had access. I didn't open the barn right away, not because I was scared. At that point I wasn't, but because I wanted to settle in before diving into whatever that building held. I spent the afternoon cleaning the house and sorting through some of his things. He left behind a lot of notes, but nothing organized. Loose papers in drawers, scraps with dates and names. None of them mentioned the barn or anyone who might come around at night. They just suggested he wasn't doing well mentally near the end, and I chalked the footprints up to maybe someone from the sheriff's department walking around the property earlier in the week. I shouldn't have ignored them. It seems obvious now. That night, after the sun dropped behind the fields, the quiet set in. Rural quiet is different when it's not your place. You start paying attention to things you normally overlook. I was lying in the spare bedroom, drifting in and out of sleep, when I heard something outside. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. Just this steady, deliberate sound of someone walking on gravel. Not rushing, not sneaking, just moving. I sat up and listened. The footsteps stopped. A few seconds passed. Then they started again, softer this time, like whoever was out there had stepped onto the packed dirt near the barn area. I got out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the window. I couldn't see much, just shadows stretching between the house and the barns. Then I heard something I still can't fully explain. It was the sound of metal tapping, light, quick taps, like someone testing the locks on the barn doors. And the taps weren't coming from multiple barns. They were coming from the long barn, the one my uncle kept sealed. I considered going out right then, but something in my gut told me to wait. I wanted to see if the person made their presence obvious before I went charging into a situation I didn't understand. I turned off the flashlight, leaned against the window frame, and just listened. After a minute, everything went quiet again. That's when I noticed a faint glow coming from a thin gap under the barn door. It was dim, like a candle, but it moved, flickered, shifted side to side, as if someone was walking inside, with a small light source. That barn didn't have power. My uncle had cut electricity to it years earlier, according to some of the paperwork I found. So whoever was in there wasn't using normal lighting. I didn't go out that first night. I know that might sound cowardly, but there was something wrong about the whole situation, and my instinct told me not to step toward that building when I didn't know who or what was inside. I waited by the window for almost an hour. The light never went out, but the footsteps didn't return. By the time I finally went back to bed, I had convinced myself someone was squatting on the property. I figure I'd deal with it in the morning. The next day, I walked straight to the barn. The padlock was still on. The door hadn't been touched, at least not physically. But close up, I noticed the dust along the bottom edge had a thin line cleared through it, like something had been dragged under the door from inside. That didn't make sense either. The gap was too narrow for anything bigger than a mouse, and whatever dragged through left a trail too wide for a mouse. I unlocked the barn and pushed the door open. The air inside felt stale, heavy. There was a strange mix of smells, old hay, rusted metal, and something else I couldn't identify. It reminded me of a basement that hasn't been opened in decades, except with a sour undertone I didn't like. The layout was simple, a central walkway with empty stalls on both sides. At first glance, it looked like nobody had used the place in years. No animals, no equipment, just thick dust and cobwebs. But then I saw the footprints. Not mine, not my uncle's. The same long, flat impressions I saw outside. They went up and down the walkway, weaving between the stalls, as if someone had walked the length of the barn hundreds of times. And every set of prints faced the same direction, toward the far end of the barn. That end of the building had a second door, smaller and older than the main one. I followed the footprints all the way to it. The door was shut, but the wooden frame around it looked scraped. Not from claws, not from tools, from something harder to identify. Smooth, shallow grooves along the frame, like someone pressed a long object against it repeatedly over a long period of time. I tugged the door open. It led to a small room I didn't know existed. My uncle never mentioned it, and it wasn't on the property layout I found. The room was nothing but a narrow space with an old cot in the corner and several sheets of paper pinned to the wall. The papers were worn from humidity. Some were half torn, but they all had the same kind of notes, dates, times, and short sentences scribbled in my uncle's handwriting. Activity at 2:13 a.m. Do not respond. Do not open the door again. Last time lasted 46 minutes. Never look at it directly. There were dozens of these notes. The dates stretched back nearly 15 years. I stepped closer to the cot and noticed something that made my stomach drop. A folded blanket, slightly damp, warm in the center. Someone had slept there recently, not weeks ago, probably hours. While I stared at the blanket, I realized something even worse. It wasn't damp from sweat. It had the same sour smell I noticed earlier. Something about that smell made my skin crawl, like it didn't belong in a place meant for people. I backed out of the room and walked through the barn again, trying to make sense of everything. When I stepped outside, the sunlight felt too bright. The air felt too open. I locked the barn, wiped my hands on my jeans, and tried to steady myself. None of this made sense. If somebody had been living there, how were they getting inside? Why were they only active at night? And what exactly had my uncle been documenting for all those years? The sheriff came by that afternoon. I didn't tell him everything. I just mentioned someone might have been squatting on the property and asked if anyone had been reported missing. He shrugged it off and said the place was probably just attracting drifters. But that explanation didn't match anything I saw. That night I stayed awake intentionally. I kept the lights off and watched from the same bedroom window. The property looked calm at first. Nothing moved. No lights. No sounds. But around midnight, I saw something. Not a person. Not exactly. A figure stepped out from behind the long barn, moving slowly along the side of the building. The shape was wrong. Too tall. Too thin in certain areas. I focused hard, trying to make out details, but the darkness swallowed most of its edges. What made my heart quicken was how it moved. Not like someone walking, but like someone adjusting their balance after every step. And its posture leaned forward, as if it was listening to something inside the barn. I stayed still. I didn't even breathe for a moment. The figure stopped near the door. It didn't touch it. It just stood there, head tipped slightly upward, as if smelling the air. Then it turned toward the house. Not quickly. Slowly. Like it already knew exactly where I was standing and didn't need to search for me. I backed away from the window, inch by inch, until I couldn't see it anymore. I didn't dare look again until 10 minutes passed. When I finally checked, the area around the barn was empty. No movement. No footprints I could see from the window. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. By morning, there were new prints outside the barn. Same shape as before. But this time they didn't pace around the door. They led from the barn toward the house. Not all the way, just halfway, stopping near the edge of the porch, then turning back. I won't drag this out longer than necessary, but everything that happened after that only made things harder to deny. Over the next week, I heard it inside the barn every night. Not walking, not scratching, just moving, a steady back and forth pacing. Like something trapped in a long hallway, but never truly leaving. And every night, the prints got a little closer to the house. The last night I ever stayed on that property, the sound wasn't pacing. It was breathing. Slow, rhythmic breathing that somehow carried across the open field and reached my bedroom window. I shouldn't have been able to hear something like that from that far away, but I did. It continued for nearly an hour before stopping without warning. When I stepped outside in the morning, the prints were no longer in straight lines. They formed circles, large circles that overlapped, like whatever made them had walked around the barn over and over, dragging its feet through the dirt in tightening spirals. I packed that day. I didn't hesitate. I didn't wait for answers. I locked every barn, every shed, and left the keys with the lawyer. I told him I wanted the entire property sold as is. A few buyers backed out after touring it, though none said why. One of them told the lawyer the place felt wrong the moment he walked near the long barn. Last I heard, the property is still unsold. I haven't gone back. I won't go back. My uncle spent most of his life dealing with whatever lived in that barn, and I'm not interested in figuring out how he managed to keep it contained all those years. I only know it wasn't human, and it didn't like being alone. I never planned on taking over my family's farm. I went off to college thinking I'd end up working somewhere in an office, maybe doing something forgettable but stable. Life didn't play out that way. My father had a stroke in his early 60s, and suddenly I was back in Iowa, standing on land that had been in our family for 3 generations, trying to convince myself I knew enough to keep the place running. I didn't. But I learned fast out of necessity. There's no pause button on a farm. The cornfields were our main crop, 30 acres of them stretching across flat ground that hadn't changed much since my grandfather first plowed it. It was predictable work in most ways. Early mornings, long afternoons, the usual cycle of planting, monitoring, irrigating, and harvesting. You get used to the rhythm. Even the quiet becomes something steady you rely on, which is why I noticed the first problem immediately. When you know what normal looks like on your land, anything outside that stands out fast. I was walking the fields on a July morning, sun already up, air warm enough to hint at a hotter afternoon. Everything looked fine until I reached the center section. I stepped into a clearing about 20 feet wide, where the corn was pressed flat in a near-perfect circle. No tire tracks, no damage on the edges, just corn laid down uniformly, as if the stalks had been gently pressed, not crushed. I crouched down and checked the soil, half expecting to see footprints or some kind of pattern. Nothing. The ground wasn't disturbed except for the direction of the stalks. I remember standing there longer than I meant to, trying to think of what could have caused it. It wasn't machinery. There was no path for anything large to get in without tearing down rows. Kids messing around didn't make sense either. The circle was too neat, too clean. Kids don't go out of their way to make something look professional. My first instinct was weather, but there hadn't been wind strong enough to do this. And even if there had been, wind leaves chaos, not a perfect shape. I chalked it up to maybe some odd settling in the soil, even though I knew that wasn't right. I told myself I'd see if it happened again. The problem was, it did. The next morning, there was another circle about 40 yards away from the first one. Same size. Same neat edges, same pressed down corn. I checked for animal damage. Nothing matched up with any kind of animal. The third morning, there was a third circle. That's when I stopped pretending it was something random. 3 times wasn't coincidence. I set up cameras that same afternoon. Nothing fancy, just battery-powered trail cameras positioned at angles to catch movement overnight. I placed one facing each circle, then added another pair near the edges of the field where someone would have to walk through if they entered from the road. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but it felt better than doing nothing. That night I stayed up later than usual, sitting by the living room window with the porch light off. I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I just wanted to see if anything unusual happened to the crops while I was awake. From the house, the fields looked like they always did, dark, quiet, motionless except for the slight breeze. Every so often I'd get this faint feeling I wasn't alone on the property, but I brushed it off as nerves. Everything is a little unnerving when your mind is already trying to solve a problem. When I checked the field the next morning, the fourth circle was there. This one was larger by a few feet, and the center wasn't pressed as flat as the others. The stalks were bent, but not in a uniform pattern. They looked disturbed, as if something had shifted around in that spot before leaving. I went straight inside and pulled the SD cards from the cameras. I sat down at the kitchen table with coffee and started going through them. The ones at the edges of the field caught nothing but wind moving leaves. The ones near the first 3 circles didn't pick up movement either. When I got to the camera pointing at the newest circle, I saw something, though not what I expected. Around 2:40 a.m., the corn at the far edge of the frame started swaying in a way that didn't match the wind. It moved side to side like someone was brushing their hands along the stalks while walking. The stalks got closer to the camera, but whoever or whatever caused it never stepped into view. The camera caught movement, but not a shape. A few stalks bent as if something tall and narrow passed between them without breaking stride, but the camera didn't catch a person or a shadow, just motion in the corn. The bending stopped right where the circle formed. The stalks lowered over several seconds, not all at once. It looked like something was kneeling or crouching, shifting weight around. Then everything went still. No sudden exit. No clear direction of movement afterwards. Just stillness until sunrise. I watched the clip at least 10 times. I tried slowing it down. I tried brightening it. Nothing made the shape visible. It was like the disturbance in the corn had no source. That bothered me more than if I'd seen someone clearly on camera. When you can't identify what's moving through your property, you can't prepare for it. I printed a few frames and showed them to my neighbor, Gerald, an older guy who'd lived in the area all his life. He squinted at the pictures for a while before setting them down and telling me something that felt too specific to ignore. He said the circles reminded him of a story he heard growing up from the man who owned my land before my grandfather bought it. That farmer claimed he used to see a caretaker walking the fields at night. Not a trespasser, not someone trying to cause trouble. Just a tall figure moving through the rows with his head down, almost like he was checking the crops. According to the old story, the caretaker didn't disturb anything except the exact spots where he stopped. He always paused in circles, always stayed hidden between the stalks, and he never left footprints. The next nights were the same pattern. A new circle each morning, sometimes small, sometimes wide enough to catch my breath when I first saw it. Always clean and always showing no sign of how someone got in or out. I got used to walking the fields right after sunrise because that was when they were easiest to spot. It became a strange routine. Wake up, throw on boots, walk to see what changed overnight. But something shifted after about a week. The circles stopped appearing randomly and started forming a pattern. They moved in a straight line through the field, like someone was marking a trail. 1 circle per night, each exactly the same distance from the last. A slow, methodical path forming across land that hadn't changed in decades. I considered calling the sheriff, but I knew how that conversation would go. There's nothing illegal about circles and crops, and telling them I had video of something invisible moving through the corn wasn't going to get me much help. I didn't want to deal with people thinking I had lost my mind, so I kept watching and documenting the pattern. 10 days into it, the path reached a section of the field I hadn't touched since spring planting. It was an older patch on slightly higher soil. As I approached the latest circle, I noticed something different immediately. The ground in the center wasn't just pressed, it was disturbed. The soil was cracked and pushed outward like something had been dug there years ago, and the ground had finally settled in a way that exposed it again. I used my boot to push aside some loose dirt. Beneath a thin layer of soil, I saw something pale. At first I thought it was a rock. Then I realized it wasn't shaped like any rock I've ever seen. It was curved, smooth on one end, rough on the other. When I picked it up, the shape made sense. It was a piece of bone. Not animal bone. At least not a type I recognized. I didn't like where my mind was going, so I put it back and covered it. I kept looking around, searching for more signs that someone had dug there in the past. A few minutes later, I found a second piece half covered by roots, then a third piece buried deeper. The more I uncovered, the more I realized this wasn't a random spot. Someone had buried something there a long time ago, and the circles had been moving straight toward it night after night, as if guiding me to it. I spent the rest of that day digging carefully around the area. I didn't find a full skeleton, but I found enough fragments to know it wasn't a single animal. I found a small metal button that looked like it came off a shirt. I found a rusted zipper buried deeper, and I found a piece of wood with faded paint on one side, maybe part of an old crate. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I stopped digging when I reached a patch of harder soil that had a faint square outline. It was too uniform to be natural. My guess was that it had once been some kind of burial box or container before time and pressure collapsed it. I stood there with dirt on my hands, staring at it, knowing I'd found something serious, but unsure how far to take it. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept imagining the caretaker story, the circles, the movement in the corn, the way the path had led straight to that exact spot. I didn't like feeling as though something on my land wanted to show me what was buried there. When morning came, I walked to the field again. There was a new circle, but this time it wasn't in the line of the others. It was right beside the disturbed pit I had made. The stalks were pressed down in a narrow oval shape instead of a perfect circle, like whatever made had stood there for a long time. I walked toward it carefully. In the pressed area, I saw lines in the soil. Long, thin tracks dragging backward as though someone had taken several steps while facing the pit. The lines were deeper near the center, almost like whoever stood there leaned forward for a while, watching the spot where I had dug. There were no footprints, only those lines. That was the moment when the situation became too real for me to ignore. I went inside and called the sheriff, telling him I'd found what might be buried human remains. He came out with 2 deputies that afternoon. They marked the spot, took the bone fragments, and promised to send them to a lab. They didn't mention the circles beyond saying they were unusual. They didn't ask about the lines in the soil. They didn't ask why the pattern of pressed corn led directly to the disturbed spot. They probably assumed I'd been out digging randomly and stumbled onto something. The sheriff called me a week later, saying the bones were old but human, probably buried decades ago, and that the lab couldn't get much else from them because they were too weathered. They didn't pursue any formal investigation beyond that. No missing person matched the condition or age range. They filed it as unknown historical remains and left it there. After that day, the circle stopped. Completely. No disturbances. No movement on the cameras. No signs that anything had been walking the fields at night. It was as if whatever had been moving through the corn had been waiting for me to uncover that site. Once it was exposed, the activity ended. But the ending didn't bring any relief. Instead, the silence felt heavier than the disturbances. A kind of emptiness in the fields I hadn't felt before. It wasn't threatening. It was more like the presence I had sensed for weeks was gone, and the land felt unfamiliar without it. The cameras eventually stopped picking up anything but weather. I left them up for 2 more weeks to be sure. Nothing happened. The corn grew back over the circles. The rows returned to normal. When harvest season came, that section of the field produced a little less than normal, but nothing dramatic enough to show a sign of what had been there. Every so often, I still walk out to that area. Not because I expect to find anything new, but because it doesn't feel like the story is finished. There's a part of me that wonders who was buried there and why the land wanted me to find it. Another part of me wonders what my grandfather knew. He spent decades walking those fields. Maybe he saw circles too. Maybe he understood the caretaker story wasn't just folklore. I never got a clear answer about what moved through the rows, or how something could leave no footprint. But after everything I saw, I'm convinced something was watching the land long before I was born. I've lived on the same piece of land in northern Missouri my whole life. My family isn't big, and most folks moved away years ago. But I stayed because farming was the only thing I ever really understood. My place sits about 15 miles outside town, surrounded by soybean fields and thick tree lines that block out almost everything except the wind. It's quiet in a way most people think they want until they actually hear how real silence sounds at night. When the sun goes down out here, you notice every little thing that moves or snaps or rustles. I raise hogs, mostly for local buyers and a couple butchers who've known my family for decades. I'm used to early mornings, late nights, and all the strange routines that come with farm work. You learn to accept that not everything follows a clean pattern. Animals act unpredictable sometimes. Weather turns fast. Equipment fails when you need it most. Things go wrong. I've never been spooked by that kind of stuff because it's normal. What happened to me in the fall of 2020 wasn't normal. I still don't have a great explanation for it. And every time I try to talk about it, I end up circling back to the same feeling. Something was on my property at night. Something that moved like it understood me watching, and something that didn't mind letting me know I wasn't the one in control. It started with the pig pen door. I built the pen myself in early 2019. It's simple, solid wood, reinforced hinges, and a metal latch that's never given me trouble. The hogs stay inside without issue. They're loud animals, but they aren't escape artists. They don't push gates open. They don't fiddle with latches. Even a curious one wouldn't get that door open without leaving marks. That's why the first morning I found the door hanging wide open stopped me in my tracks. It was late September. I walked out before dawn with a bucket of feed, same as always, and noticed something off even before I reached the pen. The hogs were scattered across the yard instead of clustered near the trough. I thought maybe the latch had frozen, or maybe I failed to line it up right the night before. I don't like to blame myself without checking. So I opened the door again and looked at everything closely. The metal was fine. No cracks. No pressure marks. Nothing bent. The latch was still stiff, which it wouldn't be if a hog had shoved it from the inside. I locked it again and chalked it up to human error. The next morning, it happened again. This time the latch wasn't just unhooked. The door was swung wide, like someone pushed it all the way open and didn't care how far it went. The hogs looked restless. They weren't loud, but they paced in a way I hadn't seen before. The kind of pacing that animals do when something isn't right. I checked the fence, the ground, the edges of the pen. There were no tracks, no claw marks, no drag lines, nothing. If an animal had come by, there would have been something to show for it. Raccoons don't open latches like that. Coyotes can't. A person could, but there were no boot prints, no tire marks, nothing disturbed in the dirt. I told myself maybe I really was slipping. Maybe I forgot to latch it twice. It sounded ridiculous even as I thought it, but it made more sense than anything else. I made a point to latch it slowly that night. I pressed the metal in tight and tugged on it twice. It didn't move. The following morning, it was open again, 3 times in a row. Same door, same latch, same lack of evidence. I knew I wasn't forgetting it anymore. Something else was happening, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't. I'm not the kind of guy who jumps to supernatural ideas. I don't talk about ghosts or strange creatures or legends. I think most odd things have simple explanations, even if we don't see them right away. That said, something about this didn't feel simple. It felt intentional. So I went into town, bought 2 trail cameras, and set them up on opposite corners of the pig pen. One aimed at the latch, one at the yard. I angled them high enough that if someone walked in, I'd see them. They were motion activated. Anything moving around the pen should have triggered them. I slept fine that night because I figured the mystery would end by morning. I'd catch a raccoon climbing on something, or maybe a neighbor's kid messing around. There had to be something on camera. There wasn't. When I walked out at sunrise and saw the door open again, I actually felt my stomach drop. Not only had the door been opened sometime during the night, but the cameras hadn't caught a single thing. Both screens showed blank footage. No hogs running. No shadows. No motion logs. The cameras acted like nothing happened at all. I checked the batteries, the SD cards, and the motion settings. Everything worked perfectly. The cameras weren't malfunctioning. That's when I started sleeping outside. I wasn't going to sit around and pretend this was fine. I set up an old recliner next to the equipment shed that faced the pen. It wasn't the most comfortable thing in the world, but it kept me out of the wind, and I could see the door clearly. I grabbed a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and my old Winchester rifle, even though I didn't think I'd need it. I didn't plan to fall asleep. I figured I'd wait out until I saw whoever or whatever was opening the damn door. Nothing happened for hours. The hogs settled down like they always did. The yard went quiet except for insects and the usual night sounds. Around midnight, I started feeling that heavy kind of tired where you blink too long. I fought it off. But eventually I must have drifted for a minute, because when I opened my eyes, the yard looked different. It wasn't darker or brighter. It just felt different. Like the air around me wasn't the same as before. I don't know how to explain that in a clean way. It didn't feel like a weather change. It felt like walking into a room right after someone whispered and stopped when you opened the door. I sat up slowly and looked at the pen. The door was still closed. I kept my eyes on it and waited. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear the latch moving. I didn't hear anything at all. It was one of the stillest moments I've ever felt. I tried to focus, but everything around the pen seemed slightly off focus, like looking through a thin layer of heat rising off asphalt. Nothing dramatic, just a small distortion that didn't belong out there in the cold. Then the door opened. The latch didn't rattle. The wood didn't creak. The hinge didn't groan. It opened like someone had already loosened everything and pushed it gently. No one was there. At least no one I could see. The hogs stayed silent. They didn't run out or panic. They stood inside the pen, facing the far corner, like something in that direction held their attention. Not the door. Not me. Something else. I stood up from the chair. The air felt thick. I tried to walk, but stopped halfway to the pen because something in my body told me not to move closer. I don't mean fear. I mean some deeper instinct that felt like stepping forward would be a mistake. The hogs stayed tense. Their ears twitched, but they didn't look at me. I aimed my flashlight at the open doorway. The beam didn't go through it clean. It dimmed the moment it crossed the threshold, like the light got swallowed. Not completely, but enough that it looked wrong. Even the dirt inside the pen looked darker than the art around it, like the inside of the pen didn't connect to the outside in a normal way. I don't know how long I stared, but eventually something changed. The hogs snapped out of their stillness all at once. They let out this low, anxious sound and backed toward the exit. That's when I forced myself to step forward. I wasn't going to let them bolt into the yard and scatter. I yelled and clapped my hands. But the moment I took another step toward the pen, every hog turned away from me. They weren't running from me. They were running from whatever had been in that far corner. The moment they cleared the doorway, the inside of the pig pen brightened like the light finally reached it again. Everything looked normal. The air felt normal. The hogs sprinted across the yard, but the moment they passed me, they slowed down and moved together again, almost like they felt safer near me than inside the pen. The door stayed wide open. I walked to it and forced myself to touch the latch. It didn't feel cold. It didn't feel warm. It felt like metal that hadn't been touched by anything at all. The hinge was steady. Everything was the same as before, except I'd seen that door open without a sound, and something had been inside that pen without showing itself on the cameras, or in the light, or in any normal way. I locked the hogs in the equipment shed that night. It wasn't meant for animals, but I wasn't putting them back in that pen. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the yard closely. Nothing else moved. Nothing else changed. The moment the sun cleared the tree line, everything felt normal again. I rebuilt the pig pen 2 weeks later, on the opposite side of the yard. I used new lumber, new hinges, new hardware, and I poured a concrete threshold under the door. The old pen, I disassembled it piece by piece and burned it. I didn't feel crazy doing it. I felt like I was cleaning something off the property that didn't belong. The new pen's door has never opened by itself.